The phone call that shattered Frank Sinatra's world came at 11:47 p.m. on December 8, 1963. Frank was at home in Palm Springs when the heavy black telephone rang with news that would test every ounce of strength he'd ever possessed. His 19-year-old son, Frank Jr., had been kidnapped from his dressing room at Harrah's Lake Tahoe. The kidnappers wanted $240,000 in small bills. They had 72 hours to deliver the money, or they'd never see Frank Jr. alive again. For 3 days and nights, the most powerful man in the entertainment would become the most helpless father in America. What happened during those 72 hours would reveal a side of Frank Sinatra that no audience had ever seen. The desperate love of a parent willing to sacrifice everything for his child's life. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's most incredible moments, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. December 8, 1963. Harrah's Lake Tahoe Casino, Nevada. 9:15 p.m. Frank Sinatra Jr. was getting ready for his second show of the evening when 3 men knocked on his dressing room door. At 19 years old, Frank Jr. was just beginning his own singing career, trying to step out of his father's enormous shadow while carrying the weight of the Sinatra name. "Room service," one of the men called through the door. Frank Jr. hadn't ordered room service, but celebrity performers often received unexpected gifts from fans or management. He opened the door without thinking. Barry Keenan, Joe Amsler, and John Irwin pushed their way into the dressing room. They weren't fans. They were desperate men with a desperate plan. Keenan, 23 years old, had grown up wealthy in Los Angeles, but had lost everything in a series of bad investments. He owed massive debts to dangerous people. Kidnapping Frank Sinatra Jr. wasn't just a crime to him. It was his only chance at survival. "Don't make any noise," Keenan told Frank Jr., showing him a pistol. "We're taking you for a ride. If you cooperate, you'll be home by Christmas." Frank Jr. looked at the 3 men. Young, nervous, clearly amateurs. This wasn't a professional operation. That made it more dangerous, not less. Professionals had protocols, systems, experience. Amateurs made mistakes that got people killed. "What do you want?" Frank Jr. asked. "Your father's money. A lot of it." Within minutes, Frank Jr. was blindfolded, bound, and placed in the trunk of a rented Chevrolet. The kidnappers had studied Frank Sr.'s schedule and knew he was in Palm Springs, far from Lake Tahoe. By the time anyone realized Frank Jr. was missing, they'd be long gone. The plan was simple. Drive to Los Angeles, hide Frank Jr. in a rented house, demand ransom from Frank Sr., and disappear with enough money to solve all their problems. What they hadn't counted on was that kidnapping Frank Sinatra's son would trigger the largest FBI manhunt in California history. December 9th, 1963. Palm Springs, California. 12:30 a.m. Frank Sr. was reading in his study when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, terrifying. "Mr. Sinatra, we have your son. If you want to see him alive, you'll follow our instructions exactly." Frank's blood turned to ice. "Let me talk to him." "That's not possible right now. But I can tell you he's alive and unharmed. Whether he stays that way depends on your cooperation." Frank had faced down mobsters, studio executives, and hostile audiences. He'd survived career destruction and public scandals. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. The realization that his child's life was in the hands of strangers. "What do you want?" $240,000. Small bills. Unmarked. "We'll call you tomorrow with delivery instructions." The line went dead. Frank sat alone in his study, staring at the phone, feeling more powerless than he'd ever felt in his life. Frank's first call was to his ex-wife, Nancy, Frank Jr.'s mother, then to his lawyer, Mickey Rudin, then, despite his famous distrust of law enforcement, to the FBI. Within 2 hours, Frank's Palm Springs home was swarming with federal agents. Special Agent in charge, Dean Elson, explained the situation. Kidnapping was a federal crime. The FBI had jurisdiction, and they had protocols for these situations. Mr. Sinatra, we strongly advise against paying ransom. It encourages more kidnappings, and there's no guarantee they'll release your son even if you pay. Frank's response was immediate and non-negotiable. I don't care about protocol. I don't care about setting precedents. I care about getting my son back alive. If they want money, I'll get them money. But Frank also understood something the kidnappers didn't. He wasn't just a wealthy entertainer. He was Frank Sinatra. He had connections, resources, and influence that most kidnapping victims didn't possess. If these men thought they could take his son and disappear quietly, they'd made a serious miscalculation. December 9th, 1963. Los Angeles, California. Hidden location. Frank Jr. was being held in a rented house in Canoga Park, a middle-class suburb of Los Angeles. The kidnappers had blindfolded him during the drive, but Frank Jr. had been paying attention to sounds, smells, and timing. He estimated they'd driven about 6 hours south from Lake Tahoe. Barry Keenan was nervous. The plan had seemed simple when they'd discussed it for months. Grab Frank Jr., demand ransom, collect the money, disappear. But actually, holding Frank Sinatra's son hostage was different from planning it. He's not eating, Joe Amsler reported. Just sits there staring at us. Frank Jr. was scared, but he was also his father's son. He'd grown up around tough people, dangerous situations, and high-stakes negotiations. He knew that showing fear would make his captors more unpredictable. My father will pay, Frank Jr. told them, but he'll also hunt you down. You know that, right? You've kidnapped Frank Sinatra's son. Every cop in America is going to be looking for you. Keenan tried to sound confident. By the time they find us, we'll be long gone with the money. Where are you going to go? My father knows people everywhere. Vegas, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. You think you can hide from Frank Sinatra? Frank Jr. was doing something crucial. He was making his kidnappers think about the long-term consequences of their actions. The more they thought about what came after the ransom, the more likely they were to make mistakes or even release him voluntarily. Meanwhile, 300 miles north in Palm Springs, Frank Sr. was pacing his living room like a caged animal, while FBI agents monitored his phones and traced possible leads. Frank had already contacted his bank and arranged to withdraw $240,000 in cash. The FBI had tried to persuade him to use marked bills, but Frank refused any strategy that might endanger his son's life. Mr. Sinatra, Agent Elson said, we understand your concern, but marked bills help us track the kidnappers after your son is released. After my son is released, you can track them all you want. Until then, we do exactly what they say. Frank's celebrity friends began arriving to show support. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and other members of the Rat Pack gathered at Frank's house, creating an atmosphere of tense solidarity. But Frank barely acknowledged them. His entire focus was on the phone, waiting for the next call from his son's kidnappers. December 10th, 1963. The ransom demand. The second call came at exactly 8 p.m. The voice was different this time, more nervous, less controlled. Mr. Sinatra, do you have the money? I have it. Let me talk to my son. There was a pause, shuffling sounds, then Frank Jr.'s voice. Dad. Junior, are you all right? Have they hurt you? I'm okay, Dad. I'm scared, but I'm okay. It was the first time Frank had heard his son's voice since the kidnapping, and he had to grip the phone to keep his hands from shaking. Frank Jr. sounded young, frightened, but alive. The kidnapper came back on the line. Satisfied? Here's what you're going to do. The instructions were complex, clearly planned in advance. Frank was to drive to Los Angeles alone. No FBI agents, no security. He would receive further instructions at specific payphones along the way. The final exchange would happen only when the kidnappers were certain Frank hadn't brought law enforcement. Agent Elson was adamant. "Mr. Sinatra, we can't let you go alone. These men are desperate, unpredictable. There's no guarantee they'll honor the agreement." Frank's answer was final. "They want me alone. I go alone. You want to help? Stay here and make sure the phone lines are clear for their calls." But Frank wasn't really going alone. The FBI was tracking his movements from a distance, using aircraft and unmarked vehicles. Frank knew this and didn't object. As long as the kidnappers couldn't see the surveillance, he was fine with it. December 10th, 1963. 11 p.m. The exchange. Frank drove through Los Angeles following the kidnappers' instructions, moving from payphone to payphone, receiving new directions at each stop. The process took 4 hours, designed to ensure he wasn't being followed. Finally, at 3 a.m. on December 11th, Frank was directed to a deserted gas station in West Los Angeles. He sat in his car, a briefcase containing $240,000 in cash on the passenger seat, waiting for kidnappers he'd never seen. Barry Keenan approached the car alone, his face covered by a ski mask. He was shaking, whether from fear or excitement, Frank couldn't tell. "Mr. Sinatra, slide the briefcase out the window." Frank looked at the young man. He could tell Keenan was young despite the mask, and made a decision that probably saved his son's life. "Before I give you this money," Frank said calmly, "I want you to understand something. If anything happens to my boy, I will spend the rest of my life and every dollar I have hunting you down. Not the FBI, not the police. Me personally, do you understand?" Keenan nodded, grabbed the briefcase, and ran to a waiting car. Frank sat alone in the gas station parking lot for 20 minutes, not knowing if he'd just saved his son's life or enabled his murder. It was the longest 20 minutes of his life. December 11th, 1963. 5:30 a.m. The release. Frank Jr. was released on a highway off-ramp in Los Angeles, exactly as promised. A motorist found him walking along the roadside, still blindfolded, and called police. When Frank got the call that his son was safe, he broke down crying for the first time since the ordeal began. All the strength, all the control, all the tough guy persona collapsed in that moment of relief. Frank Jr. was taken to FBI headquarters for debriefing, then reunited with his father at the federal building in Los Angeles. The reunion was private, but agents present later described it as one of the most emotional scenes they'd ever witnessed. "I thought I'd lost you," Frank told his son, holding him like he'd never let go again. "I knew you'd get me back, Dad. I never doubted it." December 11th, 1963. The manhunt. The FBI's investigation moved quickly. Frank Jr.'s detailed descriptions of his captors, combined with surveillance footage from various locations, led agents to identify Barry Keenan within 48 hours. Keenan was arrested on December 13th at his Los Angeles apartment, where agents found $160,000 of the ransom money. His accomplices, Joe Amsler and John Irwin, were captured within days. During questioning, Keenan revealed why they'd targeted Frank Jr. "We knew Frank Sinatra would pay anything to get his son back. He's not like other rich people. He actually loves his family." The irony wasn't lost on investigators. The kidnappers had chosen Frank Jr. precisely because Frank Sr. was known to be a devoted father, but they'd underestimated how that devotion would translate into relentless pursuit. March 1964. The trial. The kidnappers' trial became a media sensation. Frank Sr. testified about the phone calls, the ransom payment, and the agonizing 72 hours when his son's life hung in the balance. On the witness stand, Frank's testimony was measured, controlled, but filled with quiet fury. "These men took my son. They terrorized him. They terrorized my family. They thought they could take advantage of a father's love. They were wrong." Frank Jr. also testified, describing his captivity with remarkable composure. For a 19-year-old, who'd been through such trauma. Barry Keenan received a life sentence plus 75 years. His accomplices received similar sentences. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, noted that kidnapping was an attack not just on individuals, but on the safety and security that all families deserve. 1964, 1998. The aftermath. The kidnapping changed Frank Sinatra forever. He became more protective of his family, more suspicious of strangers, more aware of the dangers that came with fame and wealth. Frank Jr. recovered from the trauma and continued his singing career, but he carried the experience with him always. In later interviews, he said, "Those 3 days taught me that the most important thing in the world is family. Everything else, money, fame, success, is just decoration." The relationship between Frank Sr. and Frank Jr. was strengthened by the ordeal. They'd always had a complicated dynamic. The pressure of following in Frank Sr.'s footsteps was enormous. But the kidnapping showed Frank Jr. how much his father truly loved him. Frank Sr. never spoke publicly in detail about the kidnapping, but close friends said it haunted him for the rest of his life. The idea that his fame had made his children targets was a burden he carried until his death in 1998. The case also changed FBI protocols for kidnapping investigations. The successful resolution, combining family cooperation with law enforcement expertise, became a model for handling similar cases. Barry Keenan was paroled in 1968 after serving 4 years. He later expressed remorse for the kidnapping and credited the experience with forcing him to rebuild his life. He became a successful businessman and wrote a book about his transformation from kidnapper to legitimate success. Frank Jr. continued performing and became a successful conductor and arranger. He often said that his father's response to the kidnapping, the immediate willingness to pay any amount, the personal delivery of ransom money, the refusal to let anyone else handle the negotiations, taught him what real love looked like. When Frank Sinatra died in 1998, Frank Jr. delivered part of the eulogy. "My father was many things to many people, a singer, an actor, an entertainer, a force of nature. But to me, he was the man who moved heaven and earth to bring me home when I was taken. That's the father I'll remember. That's the love that defined him." The kidnapping of Frank Sinatra Jr. remains one of the most dramatic celebrity kidnapping cases in American history. It revealed the vulnerability that comes with fame, the power of a parent's love, and the lengths to which someone will go to protect their family. For 72 hours in December 1963, Frank Sinatra, the man who'd conquered every stage, every audience, every challenge, faced the one battle that mattered most, bringing his son home alive. He won that battle not through talent or charisma, but through the simple, powerful willingness to sacrifice everything for the people he loved. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to know that behind every public figure is a human being with the same fears, hopes, and fierce love that we all carry for our families. Have you ever faced a crisis that tested what truly mattered to you? Let us know in the comments how you found strength when everything you cared about was at stake.